All right, let's dive right into a question that seems pretty simple on the surface, but trust me, the answer is anything but. It's one of those things that might just make you rethink a big chunk of the history you thought you knew. So, I want you to actually take a second and think about it. When I say the first modern state, what pops in your head? Who do you picture as the pioneers of, modern government? I'm guessing your mind probably jumped to somewhere in Europe, right? Maybe post-Renaissance or, the birth of the United States in the 18th century. That's the standard story, that the modern state is this pretty recent Western invention. But what if I told you that whole timeline is off, and not just by a little bit, but by like 2,000 years? Yeah, so get ready for a pretty big plot twist in the story of how we organize ourselves. The source material we're digging into today points to a completely different origin story. Because the first modern state, it wasn't born in Europe. It wasn't inspired by the philosophers of ancient Greece or the engineers of Rome. Nope, its foundations were laid way, way earlier, in a part of the world that a lot of our history books just kinda skip over when they talk about this stuff. And here it is. The answer, according to the sources we're looking at, is Imperial China. Now, just look at this timeline for a second, because the scale of it is what's truly mind-blowing. We're talking about a super sophisticated, modern-style government kicking off way back in 150 BCE. To put that in perspective, that's almost 1,800 years before the states we usually call modern even started to form in Europe. Just incredible. Okay, so the big question is, what makes it modern? What was going on in ancient China that was so ahead of its time? Well, it all boils down to a really revolutionary idea about who gets to be in charge. It was basically built on two massive pillars. First, you had a really strong centralized government that could actually manage a huge territory. But the second part, this is the real game changer. It was run by a whole army of professional bureaucrats. These guys were the engine that made the whole thing go. And that was the genius of it. See, pretty much everywhere else in the world at the time, power was all about your family. You're in charge because your dad was a king or a duke or whatever. China went a totally different direction. They decided the government should be run by professionals, not just by people with the right last name. What they created was something we now call a meritocracy. Simply put, your job, your influence, it all depended on what you could do, not who your family was. For the time, this was an absolutely radical idea, and it meant the state was run by a class of super-educated professional managers. And this wasn't just some casual thing. It was a serious, highly structured system. If you wanted to be a government official, you had to go through years of incredibly difficult study. Then you had to pass the legendary imperial examination. I mean, these were brutal tests covering everything from philosophy to law to administration. Only the absolute best of the best made it through and got a job. So what happens when you build a government that runs for centuries on pure brainpower? Well, you got one big thing: stability. And I mean like an unprecedented, almost unbelievable level of stability. Check out this number, 2061. That's how many years this bureaucratic system ran pretty much continuously from 1500 BCE all the way up to 1911. Think about that. While empires all over the globe were rising and collapsing, sometimes in just a couple hundred years, this administrative machine just kept on humming. Here's a great way to see just how different things were. Let's take a snapshot of the world in the year 1000. Europe? It's this messy patchwork of little feudal kingdoms, all run by nobles who inherited their power. China, on the other hand, is this massive, unified, centralized empire run by a professional class of people who earned their jobs. In every functional way, it was a modern state, 1,000 years ahead of schedule. So what's the point of all this? What's the big takeaway? Well, it really forces us to kind of zoom out and question some of our most basic ideas about how history unfolded. The main idea here is that maybe, just maybe, our whole definition of modern is a little too narrow, a little too focused on recent Western history. When we do that, we risk missing this much bigger, much more interesting global story of how people have figured out how to govern themselves. So let's wrap it up. The key things to remember are: China had the core features of a modern state more than 2,000 years ago. This whole system, built on professional bureaucrats instead of nobles, gave it this incredible stability over the long haul. And really, it just proves that the story of modernity is way older and way more global than most of us were taught. And that kind of leaves us with a really cool question to chew on, right? If the modern state isn't actually all that modern, what other new ideas are actually ancient? What else have we gotten wrong? It's definitely something to think about. Thanks for joining me on this one.